Well, good morning, class. I hope you're all energized and ready to go. We just covered in our last video lecture energy from a biological point of view. I also want to begin with our summary of our main concepts that energy is needed to do work. There are many forms of energy, and these are interchangeable. First law of thermodynamics also tells us that the total amount of energy in an isolated system is conserved. In today's video lecture, we're going to take a view of energy from 30,000 feet level. We're going to look at energy sources and energy needs for our society, for our country, and even from a global perspective. So, the U.S. and energy sources.
Oh no, don't take my juice.
Well, we become dependent upon juice from electric outlets. This slide shows you a number of images that relate to energy at a national level. We have an image of the power grid and of nuclear power plants. We have hydroelectric, we have solar panels and wind turbines. And closer to the middle of the slide, we show you the various ways that we will use electricity. And of course, we also need energy, not only for electricity, but to produce heat and for transportation, which we'll get to in the next slide.
Why don't you just unplug sometimes?
Well, again, it's kind of hard to unplug once we get used to it. This slide comes from the Energy Information Administration. That's a government website. And it shows on the left the different sources of energy in the United States. You can see that 80% of the sources of energy in the United States are what we would call fossil fuel: coal, natural gas, and petroleum. Only about 20% of our energy comes from nuclear energy and renewable energy sources. How do we consume our energy? Well, much of this energy is used to produce electricity, but a very large chunk, nearly 30% of the energy uses in the United States is for transportation. And this turns out to be an important factor in our country because we depend relatively more on our cars and trucks for transportation. One reason, of course, is because of the size of our country. We have to move things around. But also, we in the United States have more of a love affair with automobiles than people in other countries. Also, there's a chunk that's for industry, for manufacturing and commercial uses. This slide gives you a historical perspective of how the various energy sources have changed over time. If you look back around 1860, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, most of our energy at that time was obtained from wood-burning stoves. Now, of course, we burn very little wood for energy, and we depend on petroleum, natural gas, and coal, the big three fossil fuels. And you can see that over time, we first became dependent more and more on coal, and then petroleum became more important as we developed automobiles and vehicular transportation. And now there's an increase in natural gas. The use of nuclear energy began in the 1970s or so, and other renewables only comprise a small source of our energy sources, and those are taking off, and we'll talk about those towards the end of this video lecture. So let's first talk about fossil fuels, the big three: coal, petroleum, natural gas. As we saw in one of the previous slides, there has been a significant increase in the consumption of these fossil fuels over the last 100 to 150 years. And there's also, of course, a concern about our depletion of fossil fuel reserves. These are what we call non-renewable energy sources. Where did this coal, petroleum, and natural gas come from? Well, they're called fossil fuels because they come from the decomposition of plant and animal life that occurred 300 to 100 million years ago, from what is called the Carboniferous period to the Cretaceous period, where when plant and animal life died, the remains were buried under sedimentary rock, and then the pressure in time then resulted in the squeezing out of water molecules from these remains, leaving behind hydrocarbons, which are the coal, petroleum, and natural gas. And since it takes about 100 million years for this process to occur, and we've only started using these fossil fuel sources in a significant way in the last 100 years or so, you can see that there is concern that over the next 100 years or so, that we will deplete essentially all the fossil fuel reserves that are available. I've listed some issues that you might hear about with respect to fossil fuels. The first two are very important: fracking and horizontal drilling, and secondly, shale oil and gas. We will see in the next slide how these two developments have significantly changed the outlook for petroleum, especially in the United States. Sometimes you'll hear about carbon taxes and carbon footprint as ways of enticing industries to become more efficient in their use of fossil fuels. When we think about oil, we think about the Middle East. Why? Because we've become very dependent on imported oil, and much of this oil comes from the Middle East. You may not think about this, but China and India are very important with respect to fossil fuels because their economies are growing very rapidly, and they're, of course, very populous countries. And as their economies grow, they will be consuming more and more fossil fuels. In one of the next slides, we'll talk about how the United States has an abundance of coal compared to other countries. Two topics that oftentimes come up, especially in election years, are offshore drilling and pipeline issues, because these get into political and regulatory issues between states and countries and the federal government. Actually, in some of these issues, especially the offshore drilling, it probably is becoming less important due to the first two issues, fracking and horizontal drilling and shale oil. Another topic which you've probably not heard about, but just take note, in your lifetime it may become a very, very important topic, and that is ocean methane hydrates. It turns out that in the continental floor beds, a few hundred miles off of each continent, there are deposits of what are called methane hydrates. Some estimates indicate that there is as much energy reserves in these ocean methane hydrates as in all of the other sources of petroleum based on land. The trick will be how to recover this methane from the ocean floor, and that will, of course, depend upon the ingenuity of scientists and engineers. Other issues that are, of course, associated with fossil fuels are the greenhouse effect and climate change and acid rain. We will cover these topics probably in the second semester of this course when we talk about geosciences. So this is just a quick list of a number of issues related to fossil fuels. I said that there has been a dramatic change in the oil economy in the United States since about 2008 due to hydraulic fracturing techniques, horizontal mining, and the recovery of oil and gas from shale. To show you what I mean by this, this is a plot of the various sources of petroleum starting in 1970 and projected out for the next 20 years or so. We have in the light green the conventional oil wells of the conventional type that you might find in Texas, for example. Then we have natural gas in the yellow. You can see that from about 1970 to 2010 or so, there was a gradual decrease in our conventional production of petroleum and natural gas. And this led to an increase in time in this black shaded area, which is the amount of oil that we were importing. And you can see why that became a geopolitical problem. Then starting around 2008 or so, with the development of hydraulic fracturing, or what we call fracking, and horizontal drilling, and the ability to recover oil from what is called tight oil or shale oil and gas, you can see that there is now an increase in the production of petroleum and gas from these sources, and as a result, we are depending less and less on imported oil. A good thing for our economy, and possibly, you never know, but possibly a good thing for our relationship with other countries. In our discussions of fossil fuels, we focus a lot on oil. And that's because oil can be refined to gasoline and diesel fuel, jet fuel, which are used for transportation purposes. And in the United States, we have a lot of transportation needs. So we have a need for petroleum in the United States, but it turns out that we are coal rich in the United States and relatively petroleum poor in the United States. That is, this slide shows for various countries, United States, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, the amount of coal in dark blue. And you can see that the United States has the largest known fuel reserves in the form of coal of any of these countries. And then oil, if we look at oil, it's the light blue at the bottom. In the United States, we have some, of course, but compared to other countries, a relatively lower amount. Saudi Arabia, for example, is petroleum rich, as is Iran and Iraq and the United Arab Emirates and Venezuela. So you can see why there has been this focus on oil from the Middle East. We have large deposits of coal, as does Russia and China, but we can't put coal in our internal combustion engines without first converting it to gas, what is called gasification, but that's an expensive process. The coal can, however, be used for producing electricity. Even so, there are concerns about the polluting effects of burning coal, and there are ideas of how to make it less polluting, what is sometimes described as clean coal initiatives. I now want to move on and talk about alternative and renewable energy sources, but I think I'll break because I don't want to make the video lesson too long. So we'll pause at this point, have a few questions, and then we'll continue on and talk about alternative and renewable energy sources. Okay? See you in just a few minutes.